Hi, welcome to Middle Eastern Islamic History number 7 in our series, The Rise of the Mawali. And for all of you who are familiar, I hope you'll be okay with me going over the rules again. This is not an academic presentation. I am not credentialed in any of the disciplines we're going to be talking about today. I'm not a historian. I'm not a religious scholar. I'm just an amateur who is very interested in this, and this presentation will be given from a secular perspective, meaning that it won't be based on Islamic religious beliefs and ideas about how this happened. As is typical, this is going to be a topic that could be sensitive, so of course be respectful to diverging opinions, but that doesn't mean that we can't ask questions, comments, and clarifications, right? That's the whole point of doing this as a Zoom as opposed to a straight lecture. I really enjoy the questions, comments, and clarifications that come. And as is typical of the previous lessons, the class will be a 101 and a 201. So if you don't know anything, don't worry, I'll catch you up. And if you know something already, don't worry, I'll take you to the next level. And finally, as all the previous sessions have been, this session will be recorded. You can watch it later, and you can see it again if you want to go over something that you saw or that you heard, in order to be prepared as we go through more and more diverse and complicated issues. All right, so as everybody's very excited for, it's the quiz, which you remember from last time. All right, so question number 1. What is the definition of Mawali?
I know. C.
Yeah, that's exactly right. C, Muslims of non-Arab ethnicities. Right, of course, we know that B is Mamluk or Ghulam, right? These slave soldiers that are recruited from Central Asia. The only reason I put Wali or governor here is because it has the same root, wala, and so I thought people might get confused by those terms. The Wali is a governor. Mawali is a person who is subjected to government, right? That M in Arabic tends, in the initial position, tends to create some secondary relationship with the primary word. Now, and yeah, the bureaucrats loyal to Abu As-Safa, where we'll get into that. So, question number 2. Which of the following accurately describes the coalition that Abu al-Abbas as-Saffah used to take over the caliphate from the Umayyads?
I'm going to guess C.
C is incorrect.
I'll guess A.
Yes, A is correct. As we discussed last time, Abu Abbas as-Saffah, his primary area of control was in eastern Persia, in Khorasan, and he was able to gather a lot of Persians who had been taxed, right? The Persians are Mawali, they're non-Arab Muslims, and they were taxed contrary to the Arab Muslims who were not taxed. So they rose up with him, and Shiites, of course, had been persecuted by the Umayyads, and the Abbasids promised them that they would treat them more fairly. The Kharijites in Zanj, that's the Zanj revolt, that was actually against the Abbasids themselves, and that was led by Ali bin Muhammad al-Bahraini, and he was Kharijite. It's a completely different revolt. There was no promise to the Ahl al-Kitab during the Abbasid period, and actually the irony is that As-Saffah and his successor Al-Mansur actually sent a mercenary army to the Tang dynasty to help them put down the An Lushan revolt. Now, from the Chinese historical perspective, this was almost a joke because the mercenary army was 4,000 people. And in China, 4,000 people doesn't change anything. But the mercenaries actually went in the opposite direction. All right, question number 3. Which statements accurately reflect the growth of terrestrial power during the Abbasid Caliphate? Choose all that apply.
B is good.
Okay.
And I think A is true.
Okay.
Iberia remained Umayyad.
Also E, no?
Yeah.
No, I think B is true. I'm actually liking, hang on. Lost Maghreb, lost Persia. C, D, and E are true, are they not?
Yeah, they're all true. Um, so trying to see how much everybody remembered. So we have several themes that sort of go across these answers. The first one is that they really don't acquire more territory. The only territories that they expand into are some of the islands in the Mediterranean. Otherwise, the Abbasids really don't expand their territorial outreach. And by the year 947, they've lost all of their territory except for Baghdad, which made them basically like the Papal States. There was an ecclesiastical regime. And the Umayyads in Spain, we're going to deal with them next week. But basically, the Abbasids launch a couple of raids to try and take them back, but they're all unsuccessful. As we talked about last time, Harun al-Rashid, who was the fifth caliph of the Abbasid Caliphate, actually made a treaty with the Franks under Charlemagne in an attempt to create an alliance against Umayyad Spain, but that didn't end up working out. All right, question number 4. Which statement accurately reflects the relationship between the Abbasid rulers and their religious views?
C?
That's exactly correct. C is correct. So we talked about last time that Caliph Ma'mun created this mihna, which was an Islamic Inquisition. And he, like several of the preceding caliphs, was inspired by Mu'tazila. And there's a debate as to whether Mu'tazila is part of Sunni Islam or separate. But the distinction between Mu'tazila and Orthodox Sunni doctrines that was most important was the doctrine of createdness. We talked about this in that the Mu'tazilites believe that the Quran is a created thing made by God. And the Orthodox Sunni position is that the Quran is simply a part of God. And so it is eternal, just as God is eternal.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was an inquisition, this mihna, to persecute those who believed in the Orthodox Sunni position, including Ibn Hanbal, who is the founder of the Hanbali school, which is one of the ancestors of the Wahhabi in Saudi Arabia. In terms of the other answers, regardless of the fact that the Shiites supported Caliph as-Safah, Caliph al-Mansur, his successor and brother, did not treat the Shiites well, in fact persecuted Ja'far as-Sadiq and killed him. We talked about that last time. Harun al-Rashid did build the Bayt al-Hikmah, but the Bayt al-Hikmah was almost like a university and a translation warehouse where documents from all over were being translated from whatever language they were in, be it Greek or Hindi or Sanskrit or Latin into Arabic. So it wasn't about Ismailism, it was about it was a university, and while they did translate religious texts, the primary goal was not religious. And we didn't discuss this, but Caliph al-Mutawakkil actually inaugurated a number of restrictions against the Ahl al-Kitab, against the people of the book, including the yellow taylasan. We'll talk about that a little bit more today. And Abu Hanifa was never appointed as the Qadi Qudat. Caliph al-Mansur wanted to appoint him to this role, but he refused because he thought al-Mansur was not an honest believer in God, and so he didn't want to support him. Okay, question number 5. Which 3 of the following are acceptable arguments for why Iran did not Arabize like the Levant, Egypt, and Mesopotamia?
What do you mean by Arabize? Learning the language?
Well, the thing is that, right, if you go to Egypt today, if you go to the Levant today, if you go to Iraq today, the people will tell you that they are Arabs, that they speak Arabic, that they're Muslim, all of these kinds of things. But that's not what happened in Iran. So the question is, why didn't that happen?
Well, you can say that about Muslims in Indonesia, which is also not turned Arabic.
Sure.
I would say definitely A. Definitely B. And C.
You got some of them right, but you didn't get all. But you didn't do the right 3. Anybody else want to try?
Well, I would say A is certainly true. I think perhaps E, that mountainous division does produce a certain separation.
Okay, that's 2.
Oh,
And E and F, the final one.
Nope.
um,
Anybody else want to give it?
I still think B is good.
It's actually A, C, and E. B is actually wrong. Iran was under the influence of was under control of Arabic speakers for nearly 150 years. Even if those Arabic speakers were ethnic Persians, they were Arabic speakers. The A is correct, as we talked about, right? Persian culture is a long train of continuity and no civilization. Now, I don't find A as compelling as a lot of Persians do, because of course you have a long train of continuity also in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, but
It's in Mesopotamia. It's still the people in Mesopotamia are speaking a Semitic language.
sure, but
It may not be specifically Arab. I mean, Persia, in Persian they speak Farsi. That's an Indo-European language like English.
sure, but you could say this, and like for example, the people of Dagestan, which is in southern Russia, right? They were speaking a Lesgin language before their dominant language became Arabic, and in fact, they didn't lose their Arabic language until the 19th century because of Russian influence. So the idea that people convert linguistically because the language is similar, I don't find that argument terribly compelling. People usually change the language they speak because the language that that is dominant in the area is the one that's useful, right? Now, so C is correct in that we talked about the Iranian Intermezzo. We're going to delve a little bit more into that today. But that separation of Iran from the Abbasid power prevented full-scale Arabization from occurring. And as Ralph pointed out, the mountains make assimilation difficult. This was especially true for the Kurds, who are an Iranic people who lived in the mountains. And it prevented their assimilation to Arab culture.
Richard, one question. I mean, I thought that language was something that was kind of very hard to lose. I mean, if there was dominating other people that they weren't dominating, the people still talk the language. They keep the language. I think language is something that is very, that's what I thought.
No, it's actually the exact opposite. Language is very easily lost. Think about it from an immigration perspective, right? Even when you have immigrants to the United States who move to communities that are ethnically homogenous of their own people, right? And they're still speaking their language day to day, their children speak it less and their children speak it less. You usually have the loss of a language within
in the second or third generation.
So the kind of question is that, so you mean the Egypt and the Levant, they all speak Arabic today?
Yes.
So they all can, without any dialect or any...
No, there's definitely dialectical development, but that development started from a base where they were all speaking the same Arabic, right? So if we were to take a time machine back to 1,000 years ago, and we would walk the streets of Cairo and walk the streets of Damascus and Baghdad, we would hear that there are some slight differences, the same way that English is different in London and in the United States and in Australia, but it wouldn't be so jarring. The same way that English, these differences now are not so jarring. But if you jump back now to 2021 and you go to these three cities, you would hear much more noticeable differences. They're still more or less intelligible, but it's at the point where if you're not well educated or you haven't heard a different way of speaking Arabic before, you might not understand enough to have a conversation.
If I could just comment on that, yeah, the question of language assimilation is rather complex. I mean, the Anglo-Saxons invaded England and imposed their language on the Celt speakers who were there. The Norman French conquered England, but then adopted the Anglo-Saxon language. The Magyars conquered Hungary and kept their language. The Bulgars, the Turkic-speaking Bulgars, conquered Bulgaria, but then assimilated the Slavic language. So in some cases, conquerors impose their language. In other cases, conquerors assimilate to to the popular language, and there's no simple rule there. It's a complex relationship as to which happens. Thanks.
You know,
Yeah,
that's absolutely correct. It just happens that in the case of the Umayyads and the Abbasids, there was a conscious policy to promote Arabic as the dominant language, which is why even across Northern Africa, right, Arabic became the dominant language, and we're going to see how that manifested. But Iran is very surprising in that of all the areas in the Middle East that the Abbasids and the Umayyads and the Abbasids were able to control for a significant period of time, or their vassals controlled for a significant period of time, they're the ones who do not Arabize. But
question, so Pakistan also not Arabized, right?
Sure.
Pakistan.
Sure. But I would make the argument that Pakistan was much less in the control of the Abbasids, because once Persia broke away, the territories of Pakistan sort of became semi-autonomous, independent. It's unclear exactly what the relationship was. And secondly, the areas of Pakistan that remained under Umayyad control and then Abbasid control prior to the Tahirids, those areas are what we now call Waziristan, the areas where the Taliban is dominant. It's not areas like Sindh or Gujarat, which are Sindh or Punjab, which are the dominant areas in terms of population of Pakistan, right?
So does the Persian use Arabian letter to write their own language?
Correct, yes. The Persians use Arabic letters to write their own language. They also have additional letters that they have because Persian has sounds that don't exist in Arabic.
Okay, but they don't speak Arabic. Sorry.
Correct.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you. That's a big misunderstanding.
I was going to say, you can think of it like how Japanese use Chinese characters to represent their language, but they don't speak the same way.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you. Yeah.
Sure.
So Arabian is very popular used language, just like English and the Spanish.
Yes, I would say that if you count all the dialects together as one language, then it has about 400 million speakers. Now, if you separate the dialects one by one, then the number crashes quite tremendously. Probably the most populous dialect is the Egyptian dialect, with probably around 80 million to 100 million speakers.
So does the written language all communicable? You know, can they read the newspaper to each other?
They can. The problem is that the newspapers are written in traditional Arabic, in what's called Fusha, or elegant language. And so the written language of Arabic has not changed in any serious way for 1,000 years.
So that's for the academic, they use in this kind of orthodoxy language.
Well, it's not
Arabic font is phonetic. It's phonetic, isn't it?
Correct. Which means that
so I can use Arabic to write Farsi. I can use it to write English. I can use it to write German. That doesn't mean an Arab can read it.
Correct. But the point is that the dialects are not written down. There's a very strong taboo against writing the dialects. That taboo is breaking for the Egyptian dialect to a certain degree, but the other dialects are it's seen as a very gauche thing and a very barbaric thing to write the dialects. What you should be writing is proper Arabic, this eloquent language. So if you turn on the news in Arabic, or if you pick up a newspaper in Arabic, all of these will be written in proper Arabic. They will not be written in dialect.
And it's easy to understand for everybody or not?
It depends on where you're from, right? If you're from somewhere in the upper Middle East, let's say Palestine, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Kuwait, some parts of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, it's relatively easy for you. Once you get further and further away and you're not educated beyond, let's say, 3rd grade, then it gets hard. So that's the distinction.
So this means there's an Arabic version of the Académie Française.
I don't know if there is.
Like here in Canada, when they teach French in the schools, I'm unilingual. When they teach French in the school, they teach Parisian French. They teach proper official French. And when you go to Quebec, you can't understand them.
Yeah, no, this is actually one of the things that's very common in the Arab world, and it's something we'll discuss as we get closer to modernity because it has to do with modern communication. But there's a conscious decision by Arab leaders as to how they want to speak. And for example, you have leaders like Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was president of Egypt, in the 1960s. And when he spoke somewhere between Egyptian dialect and proper Arabic. He didn't speak either one. He spoke something in the middle. And by doing that, he sounded authoritative, but could be understood by everybody, right? So you didn't need an education in order to understand him because he spoke enough Egyptian in terms of his dialect that people could understand him, but he sounded impressive and educated because he used the Fusha structure. Now, there are other leaders who will speak exclusively in dialect. There are other leaders who will speak exclusively in Fusha. There's a
Teacher,
whole,
and in the common, I mean, in regular conversation with your mother, your son, your friend,
you'll
you
speak your
speak
local
what?
dialect, your dialect.
So it's really kind of two things. I mean, wow.
Yes. No. So, for example, if I want to say, "How are you?" I'm good in my dialect, right? I speak Iraqi Jewish, right? So in my dialect, how are you is ashlonek, and the response, I'm good, ana zayn. If I were to say this in proper Arabic, I would say kayf al-hal, how are you? Ana b'khair, I'm well. So you can hear that those are two completely different wordings.
Yeah.
But you could see, but like if I want to have like a complex sentence, I don't know, the bridge is over the river. It's exactly the same. I just saw fuck nar, right? The bridge is over the river. But like, I wouldn't say it any differently in my dialect than I would in proper standard Arabic. And in many cases, this is the way that most dialects develop, right? If you know dialects of English or you know dialects of, it's usually very common mundane words that change, and the general grammatical structures and the more esoteric words tend to stay the same. All right, so as we discussed last time, Abu al-Abbas gets this mass of people together in Khorasan, in this upper area of northeast Iran, and he launches the invasion that overthrows the Umayyad Caliphate. And he inaugurates the Abbasid Empire. And now in that empire, he's got all of these Mawali, right? And we talked about in the questions that his primary support among the Mawali were these Persians, right? The Persian administrative class that were being taxed, even though they were Muslim. By the Umayyads, they considered it unfair and against Islamic law. Most Muslims would agree with the Persian position here that they shouldn't have been taxed.
Richard, and more or less what time are we talking about?
This revolt happened in 750.
Thank you.
Yeah. So as we talked about during the Umayyad period, which was 661 to 750, the Persians were a large part of the aristocracy in Iran, but that was not the center of Umayyad power. The center of Umayyad power was in Damascus. So they didn't really trust the Persians to a large degree, and they didn't really have direct connections with the Persians in a meaningful way. So they were willing to tax them, and they were willing to tax all of these different groups. Just to point out again, right, Egyptians are slowly being Arabized during this period, so they'll stop being Mawali. You have the Amazigh, or the peoples of Northern Africa, the Berber. Berber is usually the name that foreigners call them, but the proper name for them is Amazigh. We also are going to see today the nomadic Turks and the Ghulam, or Mamluk. And we talked about how the nomadic Turks are people of Central Asia. They are independent tribal confederations. They speak a number of different languages and associate with a number of different tribes. Oghuz is probably the most important group, and we're going to see why, hopefully by the end of the lesson tonight. But we have other groups as well, like the Karluks and the Turgesh. On the other side, we have the Ghulam or Mamluk, right? And these are slave soldiers. So, and these slave soldiers are almost all Turkic. Okay, so when we see the Abbasid Caliphate, right, at 800, right, because they inherited the Caliphate at 750. So now it's been 50 years, and you can see that they've lost Morocco and they've lost part of Algeria. And the Moroccan state is run by the Idrissids, and the Algerian state is run by the Rustamids. But the Rustamid dynasty is also called the Tahert, because their capital was in a city called Tahert. So when we remember what happened in Northern Africa, right? We had this long drawn out conquest that had multiple iterations. We saw that they first attacked in 647 under Abdullah ibn Asarh, and then they attacked again under Uqba ibn Nafi, who you can see over there. And then again, they attacked under Caliph Abdul Malik. And finally, by 709, they had subdued this area. But you can imagine that this area was very resistant and very opposed to long-term occupation because of this continual push for independence. So in terms of understanding what the indigenous people want, we sort of have to figure out a little bit about who they are. So you have these Amazigh, and now I'm going to separate them into three different groups. So you have the Zenata, and the Zenata are by and large in favor of the Arab conquest. They are Arabizing relatively well. You have the Masmuda, who live in the highland regions, because the Morocco and Algeria have the Atlas Mountains flowing through them. You can see them on the map there as the sort of bluish and teal area. And those Atlas Mountains are host to a number of Amazigh tribes, and those Amazigh tribes identify as Masmuda. South of the mountains is the Sahara Desert, and the tribes that exist in the Sahara Desert are the Sinhaja. Now, what's interesting for a lot of people about the Sinhaja is it's one of the few Muslim populations where the men cover and the women do not. So you can see almost all the men have full face coverings because they travel in the desert and they need protection, and the women, because they stay in the camp, don't need face coverings, right?
Which is happening in other places too, but still the women are covered and the men not, right?
I don't know how, like when it comes to Bedouin tribes, they tend to be less severe. Saudi Arabia is the one exception because of the Wahhabi story. But generally speaking, with Bedouins, they tend to be less interested in the hijab than the sedentary populations are. There was a governor in Morocco, and eventually that governor lost power. And what ended up happening is that there was an Alid revolt, right, a Shia revolt in the Abbasid territories, and they lost. The Shiites lost, and so the leader of that revolt, Idriss, actually came to Morocco and supplanted the governor of Morocco and declared an independent dynasty. Now, if we remember our chronology of Shiism, right, we remember that there are fivers, seveners, and twelvers, right? The division between the seveners and the twelvers hasn't happened yet, but the Idrissids are actually fivers. They're Zaydis. So they create the first independent Moroccan dynasty, and it is a Shiite dynasty. And we can tell that because if you look at the coins that they minted, you can actually see the name of Ali on the coins that they minted. It's in the red circle. And we would only have the name of Ali on their coins for rulers other than Ali if they were Shia, and therefore would accord him a special place. The Idrissids created the first independent Muslim Moroccan state. So they build their new capital city, which is called Fes, and Fes still exists. You can see in the picture on the lower right-hand side, Fes al-Bali, meaning the old quarter of Fez. And this old quarter has been changed somewhat from the time of the Idrissids, but the innermost areas of it are generally the same as they were during this dynasty. And they also founded the world's first Islamic university, which was called Karawain. Right? We talked about the Bayt al-Hikmah, which was built in Baghdad, which was a translation academy and school, but this was the first Islamic university. And so you can see a picture of Karawain in the upper side. Of course, after the Idrissids were defeated, they were replaced by Sunni dynasties.
Richard, I'm sorry. So when you call a university, I mean, what's the big difference between a madrasa and a university?
Between a madrasa and a university, there's probably not that much. I would say that there's more students and they're
Right.
going deeper at a deeper level of theology than at a madrasa. Obviously, this is not a secular university. They're not studying math and science and the rest of these things. But but it was a higher level of academy, and they used the word jama', which is used today for a university, as opposed to the word madrasa to describe this place.
Thank you.
Yeah. As I said, the Idrissids were Zaydi, but the subsequent Moroccan dynasties would be Sunni. And so Karawain has become a Sunni school. Eventually, in the 20th century, the Moroccan government made it a state university. But until that point, and still today, it remains, certain parts of it are a mosque. It remains a religious school. All right. We also have that the Rustamids, this Tahir dynasty. And what ends up happening here is that you have Ibadis having, right, you talked about the Zanj revolt and the Kharijites who were there. There was another Kharijite uprising, and the leaders of that Kharijite uprising were Ibadi in terms of their school within Kharijiyya. And so they were defeated and they fled to Algeria. They were actually Persian in ethnic origin, but they were able to get a lot of these Sanhaja Berbers behind them and create an inland state. Because of this, they were able to expand into a number of trade routes, and they built up connections between the north of Africa and the sub-Saharan Africa through the camel trading routes. And you can see here, this map is of trading routes that were a little bit later, but if you look at where the "and Europe" is on this map, the words "and Europe," you can see that they're going to Algeria, which was some of the initial expansion of the trading route created by the Rustamids. So they were the ones who ended up reaching Wagadu, which was an African empire that existed in what's now the countries of Mali and Mauritania. And the kingdom of Wagadu was founded by the Soninke ethnic group. You can see Soninkes on the right-hand side. The Wagadu had a king, and their title for king was Ghana. So Ghana has often become used as a synonym for Wagadu as the name of this kingdom. And this is a drawing of the Ghana Tunkamenin. Tunkamenin did not himself convert to Islam, but his descendants did. And there was a Muslim contingent in his city of Kumbisale. In fact, Kumbisale was built as a city with the king and his retinue on one side, and a Muslim quarter on the other side of the city, and in between were the commoner housing and territories. And you can see this is another painting of the Ghana Tunkamenin. And so the Rustamids were really behind fomenting this trade between Wagadu in the south and the Arab world in the north.
Yeah, excuse me, Richard. On the previous, you talk about the Ibadi Muslim. Is
Yeah.
that different than Shiite and
Yes.
Sunni?
Right. If we remember from
Yeah, exactly.
our earlier lectures, right, we had the Sunni, we had the Shiite, and we had the Khariji, or the Khawarij.
So Oman today still is the Ibadi, right?
Yes. Yeah. So if we remember, we have the Sunnis, we have the Shiites, and we have the Khawarij. The Khawarij being those who rejected both the Sunnis and the Shiites. The Khawarij underwent a number of divisions and reforms, and one of those forms is Ibadi. And so
there's no more Ibadi in Africa today.
Correct. And there's no
Only
more
in Oman, right?
and there's no more Shiites in Africa today.
Oh, okay. So Ibadi only exists in Oman today.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So of course, this slowly led to Wagadu converting to Islam. You still have some people who follow the traditional religion called Dogol in Mauritania today. But over the centuries, Wagadu ended up converting to Islam as a result of this trade and this communication that had begun between the Rustamids and the subsequent Sanhaja confederacies. All right. In Tunisia, we have the Aghlabids. Now, the Aghlabids are a very interesting case because Ibrahim ibn al-Aghlab was the founder of the dynasty. He was appointed by the Abbasids as a governor, as a wali, and he technically never declared independence from the Abbasids in Baghdad. However, he was functionally independent in every single way. He had his own military, he had his own coinage, he had his own deputies, and in fact, probably the clearest indication that he was operating separately from the Abbasids is that he had good relations with the Umayyads. And you can see in the upper right-hand side, he coordinated with them when he wanted to invade Sicily. And he invaded Sicily in the name of the Abbasids because he was their suzerain. But the conquest was his, and he actually coordinated it with the Umayyads. So so their soldiers fought together, the Umayyad and Aghlabid soldiers. He also was responsible for renovating the waterworks throughout Tunisia, building on the old Roman aqueducts and water supplies, but enhancing them and allowing much more water to be collected and distributed. You can even see an Aghlabid cistern in Kairouan. He also built and expanded the Great Uqba Mosque in Kairouan. Kairouan, of course, being his major spiritual city, and Tunis being his major port city. So you can see that slowly the countries of Northern Africa are breaking off from the Abbasid Caliphate, as we sort of discussed in the quiz. This is a little bit later, but one of the governors or wali that was appointed by the Abbasids in 935 was Muhammad ibn Turkish al-Ikhshid. Now you can see this name, Turkish, doesn't really sound like an Arabic name because it isn't. This is a Turkic Mamluk soldier. And so he, despite being a slave soldier, he was given the governorship of Egypt. And he was able to do the same thing that the Aghlabids did, mainly that he created his own country with his own army, except he never declared independence. And so he was technically still part of the Abbasid Caliphate, but in every way that matters, he was running his own empire. And some of the things that are interesting about this, other than the fact that we have basically another Mamluk government, is that he developed what would become iconic in Egyptian militaries for the next 400 years, which is that you would have the Turkic soldiers on horseback, and you would have and African infantry. So the Arabs were basically cut off from military function. Only Africans were involved in the infantry, and only Turks were allowed to ride on horseback. And all of these Turks were slave soldiers who were bought from the Persia controlling states. And we're going to talk a little bit about where they came from soon. Now, Muhammad ibn Turkish al-Ikhshid ruled until he died, and then his slave, Abu al-Miskafur, inherited the power from him. At first, he didn't inherit it in name, only in action, but eventually he inherited it in name. And we don't know the actual origin of Abu al-Misk, but we believe that he was either from southern Sudan or from Ethiopia. He was very dark-skinned. Contrary to what we've seen on the slavery side, it seems that he was very highly regarded by the Turkic Mamluk soldiers because of his ability to effectively command the military. Unfortunately, the Ikhshidids were defeated and they were destroyed by the Fatimids. We're going to discuss them a little bit in a little bit. All right. So to sort of put together what we've sort of seen, this is an anachronous map, right? So the timing is not exactly right. But you can see the Idrissids are in Morocco, the Rustamids are in Algeria, the Aghlabids are in Tunisia, and the Tulunids are in Libya and Egypt. And so basically, the Abbasids have really lost Africa. The Aghlabids and Tulunids are still respecting, this is the Tulunids. The Tulunids, as we said, broke away first, and then the Abbasids recovered them, and then the Ikhshidids broke away second. But the key point here is that the Abbasids really lost control of Africa pretty early on into their rulership, as they were losing control of Persia at the same time. So if we go back to the Abbasids in Baghdad, right, we mentioned that you had Caliph Mamun, and after him, he began to also import a number of these Turkic slave soldiers to serve as his elite guard. And then the Turkic slave soldiers thought to themselves, well, why don't we get to choose who rules? Why don't we're the actual power behind this state? They didn't want to run for the position of caliph because they knew that the caliph had to be an Arab, right? We've talked about this, that both the Sunnis and the Shiites agree that the caliph has to be from the tribe of Quraysh. So they decide that they want to choose who the caliph will be, and there were several caliphs who decided that they didn't agree with this situation, and so the Turkish soldiers imprisoned them or killed them, and then chose somebody else. And so this period where the rulership was based in Baghdad, but the Turks were really ruling out of Samarra, is called the Anarchy at Samarra, right? And you can see this is a family tree of all the relevant Abbasids with numbers next to them indicating which number Abbasid they are, right? The 8th king, the 9th king, the 10th king. So, 8th caliph, 9th caliph, 10th caliph, and so on. And you can basically see that with the exception of Al-Mu'tamid, none of them really last very long, right? They last for a year, 2 years, 3 years. The only other one that has a lot of time is Al-Mutawakkil. And Al-Mutawakkil issued a decree in 850 called the decree of Al-Mutawakkil. And in that decree, he, for the first time, used yellow as a distinguishing color for Jews and Christians, that they had to wear this color and they were to be denied several distinct privileges while being in the empire. This was the first time that the color yellow was used to mark the Ahl al-Kitab in public as a distinct group of people.
And the Jews, did they have access to markets, or they were, do they lend money? Did they?
Yeah.
What was their power?
No. By and large, the restrictions that existed in the Christian world did not exist in the Muslim world. In Mesopotamia, I don't know if Jews were banned from artisanry, because in some parts of the Islamic world, like for example Morocco and Yemen, they weren't. But generally speaking, Jews were involved in banking and finance in the Islamic caliphates as well. So one of the things we discussed last time, and we're going to delve a little bit more in depth here, is the Iranian Intermezzo. So you have these 4 empires that exist in sequence: the Tahirids, the Safarids, the Samanids, and the Buyids, right? And the Tahirids are originally an Arabic-speaking Persian group, but because because Tahir ibn Hussein had helped Caliph Mamun secure his power, he was given practical autonomy over his territory. And you can see that it's a significant portion of that territory, and it also borders on the Turkic-controlled areas, right? The independent Turkic-controlled areas. And so this is where the Mamluks would come from, because the Tahirids had to patrol that border region, and they would occasionally go on raids to attack the Turks preemptively to prevent the Turks from raiding them. And accordingly, you would have Turks who were captured and then traded in the cities of Samarkand or Bukhara or Urgench, and these would become the Mamluk who would be used in Baghdad or in Egypt. And this created this sort of trade network. When the Safarids took over from the Tahirids, they conquered the Tahirid territory, they were the first to reintroduce the Persian language. And they spent an incredible amount of time trying to reorganize and re-Persianize what had become an Arabic-speaking bureaucracy, right? Because even though these were Persian Dehqan who had been serving in the Tahidid period and during the previous Abbasid period, they were ethnic Persians who were speaking and working in Arabic. And so the Safavids went through and standardized the Persian language, so that way Persian could again be the dominant language. Now, they didn't replace the alphabet because, of course, that would ruin literacy, which is why Persian is still written with the Arabic alphabet, but they standardized the language. Now, the Samanids did a lot of heavy lifting in terms of developing culture. They were huge patrons of the arts and of architecture. And under their rule, we have the creation of numerous Persian language epics, especially the Shahnameh of Ferdowsi. If you're familiar with, the Shahnameh comes later. They started the funding for that. They also started a number of other distinct traditions that we see within the Persian Empire, such as creating the Ghaznavid army, which was made of, you had a number of Turkish slave soldiers. Previously, the Safavids and Tahidids had used Persian soldiers. The Samanids decided to augment this by creating their own Mamluk army, similar to the one that we saw in Iraq and in Egypt. And then finally, the Buyids, as the last Persianate state, were the ones to restore Persian court customs. So, for example, the Buyids leader was called the Shah, similar to how previous Iranian rulers had been Shahs, right? And you had the court customs returned, the language had now returned. It was now a Persian empire with Islam as a dominant religion. And one of the unique things about the Buyids is that they were also Zaydi, right? They're Zaydi Shiites.
Richard?
Yes.
Question. I see that timing and territories overlap of these four periods or four ruling territories.
Mm-hmm.
How come?
Each of these maps is the maximalist extent of the dynasty. So the map of the Tahidids, I think, is from 860. The map of the Safavids is from probably closer to 905, 910. The map of the Samanids is probably closer to 870. The map of the Buyids is closer to 950.
Okay, but what about the timing? Timing also overlaps.
Yes, because they didn't all control the same areas. The Tahidids and Safavids had some overlap. The Safavids and the Samanids had some overlap. The Buyids and the Samanids also had overlap. They controlled different parts of Iran, right? Like if you see this map here, right, you can see the Samanids are controlling an area, the Safavids are controlling an area, the Buyids are controlling an area, and there are three other dynasties that I didn't even mention, which are the Ziyarids, Salarids, and Shirvan.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So
Persians always Shiite.
no, the Tahidids, Safavids, and Samanids were all Sunni.
Only Buyid become Shia.
Yes, and they were Zaydi Shiite. They were fivers. They weren't 12ers.
They are fiver Shiite up to today.
No, today they're 12ers. Modern Iranians are 12. There's a lot that happens in the last 1,000 years. But one of the things that you might notice if you look at this map very closely is that the Buyids actually are the first Persian dynasty to control Baghdad. And ironically, they're the only ones who aren't Sunni, right? So now you have a Shiite power controlling what is effectively the center of Sunni Islam. Because the Abbasid Caliphate is the center of Sunni Islam, right? We've got Baghdad right here, right in the center of the Buyid Emirates. Now, the reason it's called the Buyid Emirates is because it's actually made of a number of different smaller states that are all ruled by different Buyid princes. All of these princes being brothers or cousins of one another. Now,
Richard, were there times that they were in peace, the Sunni and the Shia, or they were always fighting each other?
it was more that the dynasties were fighting each other. It had much less to do with the Sunni Shiite divide in terms of Iran. In terms of Iran, it was basically each one of these families was trying to control more territory at the expense of other ruling dynasties. And the thing is that the area that they were controlling, right, is the middle of the Silk Road. So it's an incredibly prosperous and wealthy area. So in this part of the world, it's much less about religion and much more about money. When we get to the western part of the Middle East, right, when we get to Egypt and the Levant region, especially when we get closer to the Crusades, it's going to be a lot more about religion, but here it's not.
So, Richard, in Persian, this land, they used to be controlled by Sunni, then become Shiite. How about the people? Does the people convert, or they?
Well,
since the.
I mean, this is something that we're going to cover, in 3 years, right? The length, the speed that we're going. But no, in the 1500s, there is there's a Shiite Sufi group called the Safaviya, and they managed to take power in Iran, and they forcibly convert a large section of the population to Shiite Islam, their Shiite Islam, which is a part of the Twelver Shiite Islam at that time, and that's when the population shifts from majority Sunni to majority Shiite. There are always going to be Shiites in Iran. And even today, there are still lots of Sunnis in Iran. It just happens the majority are Shia.
Okay.
Shah Ismail, right? You're talking about Shah Ismail?
Yeah. Shah Ismail was actually a Sufi monk. So just to give a little bit of color, right? So the Buyids are what are called Dailamites. They're from a region called Dailam in the mountains. And they were expert cavalrymen. We have very little that was built by them that still stands. One of the few things we do have is the Jurjir Mosque in Isfahan, so you can see their architectural style, and you can see the round city, the central city of Baghdad, as it would have looked when they conquered it. So, because I imagine it's getting a little hairy trying to keep all the sects in order, given the questions I've had to field. So if we look at this, right, we can see that, right, there's Sunni, there's Shia, and then there's something else, right? And the Sunni and the Shia split. The Sunni basically stay along the same trajectory. The Shia split between Zaydis and the main Orthodox that will then split into Ismailis and Twelvers. And then we have our other categories, like the Kharija, who become the Ibadi that we've seen in Algeria and exist now in modern Oman. And we had the Mu'tazila, right, that we saw at the beginning of the Abbasid Caliphate, that basically wore out their welcome after the MENA.
So when we said today the Muslim population is 25% of the total population in the world, that means that there is a lot of groups.
There are a lot of groups, but in terms of this rubric, the Sunnis who are under the orthodoxy, and generally under fiqh, as opposed to under Sufism, probably make up about 80%, 60% of the world's Muslim population. So although there are a lot of groups, they're not evenly balanced. And the Sufis probably make up another 20 to 30%. Sunni Sufis. Right, the majority of the world is Sunni. No, sorry, the vast majority of the Islamic world is Sunni, upwards of 80%.
Wow.
So we have a lot of these groups, and of course these groups are fighting. But the thing is that the fact that the Sunnis are dominant around the world, it was not a given, right? We're going to see, for example, with the Fatimids, that this was a Shiite dynasty, and they were the most powerful dynasty in the world when they were around, right? So one of the, if we go back to our family tree, right, you can see on the right hand side, right, we have the first person who's Ali, right, Ali, and then you have Hassan, you have Hussein, then you have Hussein's son, Ali ibn Hussein, who's there, the fourth Imam, and then from that fourth Imam we have that split, right, we have that split between Zayd ibn Ali and Muhammad al-Baqir. And Zayd ibn Ali, the ones who follow him, became Zaydis, right? We've seen Zaydis in Morocco, We've seen Zaydis in the Buyids, and we see Zaydis today in North Yemen, right? So, but the rest of the Shiite population went with Muhammad al-Baqir, and those who followed him would then go to Ja'far as-Sadiq, right? So Ja'far as-Sadiq, we talked about him before. He was persecuted by Caliph al-Mansur of the Abbasids, and but he was the 60th Imam. Now in order to prevent further discrimination against the Shia, Ja'far as-Sadiq nominated 4 people as his successors. 2 of the candidates did not get a large following, but 2 others did. So you have Musa al-Kazim and Ismail ibn Ja'far, right? So the Shiite tree is branching off again. So those who follow Ismail ibn Ja'far are called Ismailis, right? Which makes sense. So Ismail then fled. Oh, sorry, one of his grandchildren who followed him fled to Tunisia to avoid persecution. And when he arrived in Tunisia, he was able to overthrow. He arrived in the city of Mahdiya. You can see on the map there. And when he arrived there, he met with a number of Masmuda Berbers, and together he overthrew the Aghlabids and established the Fatimid state. Eventually, that state would call itself a caliphate. So this is the first and only Shiite caliphate in history, right? They're Ismaili Shia. And one of the things that we didn't talk about with the Ibadis is that they were incredibly religiously tolerant when they were ruling Algeria. You have Ibadi Muslims, non-Ibadi Muslims, Jews, Christians, a number of other minorities existing there. And the Ismailis are actually very similar to this. The majority of the population under their control would be Sunni, but they had a fanatical Shiite core, and they were able to spread their religion through du'a, or evangelism. And they were able to convince a number of Sunnis to abandon Sunnism and become Shia. After unifying their area in Tunisia, they conquered Morocco, but then they lost Morocco to a different Berber confederation, and so they pulled back and then decided to conquer Egypt. And the conquest of Egypt was led by this man, Jawhar as-Sakili. Sakili means Sicilian, because he was actually a white Sicilian slave soldier. Since he was a white slave soldier, he was called Sakaliba. We're going to see more about Sakaliba next week when we talk about Andalusia, because we're going to see a lot more white slave soldiers in Spain, naturally. And Jawhar as-Sakili served the Fatimids and was able to conquer the major cities, including Cairo. And he, along with the Fatimid rulers, created what was called Kahira Mu'aizia, or the jewel, the Cairo the jewel. And it's this internal area of Cairo. You can see it in the picture on the lower left-hand side, filled with mosques and government buildings. It was designed to be the center of the Islamic world, which it effectively became. And despite still having a majority Sunni population, it was now the center of the Shiite Caliphate. Now, no country prior to the Fatimids had declared themselves a caliphate, with the exception of the Umayyads in Spain, right? The Umayyads declared a caliphate in 929, but the Fatimids were within shooting distance of the Abbasids, and they had the audacity to call themselves a caliphate. Especially, they were a Shiite caliphate, which was a clear jab at the authority of the Abbasids. That said, though, the Abbasids couldn't do anything. They had no military of their own at this point, right? They're in Buyid territory, and the Fatimids were able to take the claim to be the caliphs. And in fact, they, as you can see from the map, their conquest included Mecca and Medina, which meant that this was the first and only time that Mecca and Medina would be under the control of the Shia. The Fatimids were known for, as I said, similar to the Algerians under the Rustamids, the Fatimids were known for being incredibly tolerant, and there's a reason, for example, that when Rabbi Moses ben Maimonides fled southern Spain, he went to Fatimid Cairo and became the chief surgeon for the caliph there. All right, any questions on the Fatimids or Ismailis?
No,
I wanted to say he was Maimonides was the chief surgeon for Saladin, right?
I don't think it was Saladin. I think Saladin lived about.
I'm
100
pretty
years
sure.
later.
So it's Ayyubid. Well, I'm pretty sure.
Okay. Okay.
Richard,
Yeah.
another question. What was the relation, if any, between Fatimids and Umayyads in Spain?
The relations between them were relatively bad. And in fact, the reason that they were pushed out of Morocco was because the Umayyads instigated a Masmuda Berber revolt against the Fatimids, right? So you had a number of proxy wars between the Umayyads and the Fatimids in Morocco. Between the two of them. As far as I can tell, the Umayyads didn't actually fight on African soil. Other than in Morocco.
Okay, thanks.
By the year 950, right, this was just before the Fatimids conquered the Middle East. We can see that basically nothing is controlled by the Abbasids anymore as a direct rulership. All right, so this is actually where the Druze religion comes from, D-R-U-Z-E. So this is going to be our first post-Islamic religion, and it's one of the few post-Islamic religions where we actually know the extent of what we don't know, which is not the case with a number of other ones, because similar to a number of post-Islamic religions, Druze religion features heavily on batiniya, or secret knowledge, right? We've talked about this when we talked about the tenets of Islam, that Shiites have this tendency to embrace batiniya, this secretive knowledge, as opposed to dhahiriya, the knowledge that is apparent. So you have the 6th Fatimid Caliph, Al-Hakim. You can see a picture of him there. One day, he had been ruling for 6 years. He walks out in the middle of the night and he disappears. And a number of devotees believe that he has not died or otherwise, but that he is in secret waiting to reveal himself and bring about the end of days, right? So you have Al-Hakim and his followers, led by a man named Ad-Darazi, reveal the Epistles of Wisdom, which is a holy book of their own, a holy book that comes after the Quran, which is one of the reasons why they're not considered Muslims, right? Because we talked about how Muhammad is the final prophet, so you can't have a prophetic book after him. And these Epistles of Wisdom, we've seen parts of it, we don't know the whole thing. The Druze religion is divided quite strongly between two groups. One is called the Uqal, or the knowledgeable ones, and the Juhal, or the ignorant ones. The Juhal make up the majority of the Druze population, and you can only become Uqal if you're a male Druze and you're over the age of 40 and you've been an active participant in the community. Basically, it's a very rigorous process to prevent people from acquiring the batin, the secret knowledge, who wouldn't otherwise be willing to keep it. But we know certain aspects of their religion. For example, we know that they meet in buildings called maqam, or place. It's literally translated as place. But they meet in these maqam as opposed to mosques. And they meet in these maqam on Thursdays, and they share a meal there. And the Druze, because of this Uqal-Juhal distinction, only the Uqal can speak on issues of the community, which is why, for example, if you look at this protest in Syria, on the upper right-hand side, the majority of people in the front are Uqal, and behind them are Juhal, and you can identify the Uqal because they have that turban with the white around the edges and the red on top. and they're waving there the Druze flag, symbolic of the 5 aspects that they believe contribute to proper behavior.
Richard?
Yeah.
Are the Druze ethnically different?
No, they're Arab.
Okay.
Now, originally, the Druze religion starts in Egypt, which is natural, right? They're revering the Fatimid Caliphate, but later Fatimids consider them a heresy and expel them. So the majority of Druze today are in the Levant region, southern Syria, Lebanon, and northern Israel. And because Druze only marry Druze, and they closed off their religion to converts about 1,000 years, about 100 or 200 years into the existence of their religion, they're primarily non-transitory, and they almost all stay in the Middle East.
Richard, I just want to clarify that Al-Hakim is not the same as the 12th hidden Imam of the Shiites, because the story is the same.
Yes.
Because he went into hiding, right? So.
But yeah. Al-Hakim is only revered this way by the Druze. Ismailis do not consider, Nizari Ismailis and Musta'in Ismailis and other Ismailis do not consider him to be the final Imam or Mahdi. And the 12ers certainly do not consider him to be the final Imam or Mahdi, because he is within the Ismaili lineage, as opposed to the lineage from Musa al-Kazim.
Thank you.
Yeah. So by the year 1000, this is what we're looking at, right? The Fatimids control most of northern Africa. The Buyids control most of Persia and Mesopotamia. But if we look further east into Persia, into Khorasan, into what's now Afghanistan and Central Asia, we have 2 dynasties that look very strange here, the Karakhanids and the Ghaznavids. And so let's dig a little deeper into them. So I couldn't find a Karakhanid map that I liked that with modern borders. So I tried to sort of do it here. The area in that orange circle, those are the main cities of Uzbekistan. And the area inside that red sort of arrow point, those are the borders of China. So you can see that the Karakhanids are located in Central Asia.
So where is Bukhara, more or less, to figure out where you are?
Okay.
Oh, I can see Bukhara.
Mhm.
Okay. And Samarkand. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the Karakhanids were a Turkic tribe. We don't know exactly the way that they were composed, but it seems like the dominant components are from the Karluk tribes and from the Shidlik tribes. And originally they were Tengrist, right? That animistic faith of the Mongolian people, where they believe in the sky. They worship the sky. That's why it's called Tengri, the Tengri being the name of the sky. But Satu Bukhra Khan in 934 converts from Tengrism to Islam, and he declares that the Karakhanids are now an Islamic empire. Similar to other steppe nomadic peoples, they are incredibly effective on horseback, and they pose a direct challenge to the other sedentary peoples, especially the Samanids toward their south. And so we can see, for example, on the upper right-hand side, this is a drawing of the Samanid Shah Nuh II fighting against the Karakhanids. The Karakhanids were supporting an uprising against his rule. And the Samanids actually called on their Turkish vassals to help fight the Karakhanids. And they were able to put down this rebellion. But there were several others that eventually destroyed their rule. You can see, for example, the Karakhanids taking a fortress in Kakakha, which is in modern-day Shahristan, Afghanistan. And their ability to move effectively on horseback and have such a large coalition meant that only a very large and powerful opposition would be able to contain them. And so in order to do this, the Samanids created a large-scale Turkic military. And that military would itself revolt against the Samanids and declare a state of its own. So you have a number of these slave soldiers who are garrisoned, especially in the city of Ghazna, which is in modern day Afghanistan. And you can see on this map here, the area inside of Central Asia and Northern Iran that's inside of the shape, that area is the one that was ruled originally by the Ghaznavids when they took over from the Samanids. And they conquered that territory. They led raids into all of the areas that are in that light yellow. So the Ghaznavids were led by a former slave named Mahmud of Ghazni. Mahmud of Ghazni was the first to actually reach out to the caliphs in Baghdad and said, look, right now you're under the control of a Shiite leadership. Wouldn't you prefer to be allied with a Sunni state? And so the caliph in Baghdad gave Mahmud of Ghazni a coat, this caliphal coat was indicative of his right to rule as a Sunni leader. Mahmud of Ghazni continued in terms of his internal politics to support many of the Persianization efforts that have been started by the Samanids and Safavids before him. In fact, he attracted numerous scholars to his capital in Samarkand. One of those being Biruni, who was a polymath and philosopher. Biruni is actually very famous. You can see that's actually a postage stamp from the Soviet Union of him. And Abu Rayhan Biruni was very famous for traveling in India and giving an unbiased account, or relatively unbiased account, of the Hindu religions that he encountered and Buddhism, and explaining their different beliefs in comparison to Islam. You also have the attraction of Ferdowsi. He wrote a number of couplets about Mahmud of Ghazni, and there's a famous story that Mahmud of Ghazni said that he would pay one piece of gold for every couplet that Ferdowsi would write about him. And Ferdowsi agreed, but said that you should pay me at the end. So at the end, he wrote 60,000 couplets and received a gold shipment of 60,000 golden pieces. Unfortunately, the shipment came just as Ferdowsi had died, so the money never actually got to him. But that should show you the relationship that Mahmud of Ghazni had with this sort of educated Persian culture, despite the fact that he was a Turkic soldier, a slave Turkish soldier. And he had been educated growing up, but he wasn't as educated as the people he surrounded himself with. On the other hand, he's also known as the Butcher of India, because he invaded India 17 times. He sacked a number of temples and brought the wealth back to Ghazna. Yeah, sorry, his capital was in Ghazna, not Samarkand. Back to his capital in Ghazna. Particularly, he sacked Somnath Temple, and there are debates as to the extent of the damage that he committed. But we know that hundreds of millions of dinars worth of gold, silver, elephants were plundered from India and brought into the Ghaznavid state. So on the outskirts of the Ghaznavid state are the Oghuz. And the Oghuz were first a vassal of the Khazars and eventually became vassals of the Karakhanids in their fights against the Ghaznavids.
Richard, is Oghuz same as Oghuz?
Yeah, Oghuz. That G, right, it has that sort of mark over it. That's the son of R. It's we don't have it in English, but in Turkic languages it's very common. So
okay, so it's Oghuz, right?
Yeah.
Same as you mentioned, I think last week.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so does the Oghuz send the chivalry to help Tang Dynasty, right?
No, the Abbasids sent mercenaries to the Tang dynasty. Those mercenaries.
Okay, opposite.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. So the Oghuz were vassals of the Khazar Khanate before becoming vassals of the Karakhanid Khanate, and they fought with the Ghaznavids on several occasions, and they were led by their chief. The term Bey means prince or sultan. So Seljuk Bey means Seljuk prince, right? And he was their leader as they were migrating across the steppes and fighting alongside the Karakhanids against the Ghaznavids. So eventually, though, they lost their welcome in the Karakhanid state, and they petitioned the Ghaznavids for the ability to enter their territory, and they had been let in by a traitorous governor in the northwestern area of the Ghaznavid territory. You can see the map in the lower left-hand side. All of that area that's in light blue that was controlled by the Seljuks was effectively given to them by a traitorous governor of the Ghaznavids. And so Mahmud of Ghazni tried to fight them, and his son Mas'ud of Ghazni also tried to fight them, but they were able to defeat every army that was sent to them. They even petitioned for the right to be defenders of Ghaznavid territory and suzerains of the Ghaznavids, but the Ghaznavids refused to accept it until after the Seljuks had defeated wave after wave of Ghaznavid forces. And in 1037, Tughril Bey, because you can see here, Seljuk had two sons. He had more sons, but these are the two important ones. Tughril and Jaghreh. Tughril conquered the city of Nishapur, which had been one of the major cities of Iran. And when he did so, he basically said that he wanted to preserve the Persian bureaucracy, and he wanted to practice Islam as the Persians practiced it. And this created a new fusion in terms of the way that Turkic leaders would govern, that they would use Persian aristocrats and bureaucrats in terms of how they could manage the empire, and the Turks would focus on the fighting. So they had this sort of bi-level system. Tughril and Jaghreh then decided to split, and Jaghreh moved east and Tughril moved west in order to conquer the remaining territory of the Ghaznavids. In 1040, the last Ghaznavid army met them in a small town called Dandanakan outside the city of Merv. And as you can see from the image, the Ghaznavid army was marching towards the water source, and the Seljuk cavalry came in from the sides and completely eliminated the military. The Ghaznavids were completely shot down. It didn't help, of course, that the Ghaznavids were also fighting over who could get access to the water first among the soldiers. The victory at Dandanakan was so impressive that the Seljuks didn't even believe that they had won everything. They were sort of encamped there waiting for the next wave of Ghaznavids to come, and they didn't. And the reason they didn't was that Mas'ud of Ghazni was actually killed in palace intrigue when he returned from the battle. Because of this, the Seljuks were able to conquer most of Ghaznavid territory and push the Ghaznavids into what's now Pakistan, and they were able to focus their energy on the situation in Mesopotamia. Now, when they did so, they reached out to the Caliph, and of course they made the same argument that Mahmud of Ghazni had made, which is that they were Sunni and that the Buyids were Shia. So it made more sense for them to support a Sunni claimant, and the retinue around the Caliph was very anti-Shiite. So the possibility of a conquest by a Sunni leader was very appealing to them. And so they reached out to Tughril Bey in order to attack and take Baghdad. The Buyids retreated, and accordingly, Baghdad was freely taken by Tughril Bey and integrated into the Seljuk state, which meant that it was the first time in 50 years, in almost 100 years, that Baghdad was under Sunni authority again, under the authority of a Sunni empire. And it put the Seljuks directly on the border with the Fatimids, right? The most powerful Sunni state is now on the border of the most powerful Shiite state. When Tughril and Shaghrab passed on, they were succeeded by their son, by Tughril's son. Alp Arslan. You can see in the picture on the right-hand side. And he served alongside his favorite Persian bureaucrat, Abu Ali Hassan ibn al-Tusi, but he's more commonly known by the name Nizam al-Mulk, which means the organizer of the kingdom, or the system of the kingdom. And Nizam al-Mulk was the first one to devise the system of iqta', which was to divide the empire into feudal parcels. And the Turkic leaders could take these parcels, but they wouldn't be allowed to hurt any of the civilians inside. Instead, they would have to create wealth by taxing the local population on their production. So it meant that the Turks would not ravage the countryside and could instead form peaceably into a large-scale empire that would pay at least nominal service to the Great Seljuk. He was also responsible for the construction of Nizamiya University of Baghdad. That university doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately, but I took a picture of a university that would have been similar in size and scope. Nizam al-Mulk was, through this system, was able to prevent large-scale revolts and dissension from Seljuk rule, especially by many of these different Turkic clans that had allied with Shaghrab or Tughril in order to gain power. Unfortunately, Nizam al-Mulk was likely killed by assassins, and it's those assassins being one of the first prominent victims of their reign of terror. At the same time, Alp Arslan was working on the military advantage, the military fight, and so we have the Battle of Manzikert. So the Battle of Manzikert is when the Byzantine Empire was trying to defend their fortress at Manzikert from a Turkish invasion. And so Alp Arslan leads the Seljuk light cavalry. He surrounds the forces of the Byzantine emperor. And you can see from the picture on the lower right-hand side, this is a medieval European painting. Emperor Romanus IV is captured by Alp Arslan, and he humiliates him. And there's a famous exchange between them that basically goes along the lines of, what would you do? Alp Arslan says to Emperor Romanus IV, what would you do if you had captured me? He said, I'd kill you. And Alp Arslan says, I will do worse. I'll let you live. And so he sent Romanus IV back to Byzantium and took most of the Anatolian Peninsula from him. It was a major turning point, and there are several reasons why the Byzantine army fractured. Some believe it was dissension within the ranks, that reinforcements that were supposed to come didn't come, and other issues. But regardless, it proved the adaptability of the Oghuz Turks and specifically of these Seljuks and their cavalry. One of the things that's a little difficult for outsiders to sort of see is that you can see, if you look at this map of the Anatolia between 1072, right? The Battle of Manzikert was 1071, but in 1072 versus 1075, you can see that almost all of Anatolia gets swallowed up by the Seljuk advance. But in many ways, this is not a unified Seljuk military campaign. Each of the different Turkic tribes attacked and took its own small territory and proclaimed loyalty to the Seljuks. So what it would really look like is something closer to the map on the lower left-hand side. Now, the map on the lower left-hand side is from a different time period, but you can see how you have all these little statelets and carved things, and that's really what it looks like. Similarly, this is a map from a different time period, slightly different time period, but you can sort of see all the areas that are red, gray, or light pink are all or brown are nominally Seljuk territories, but a lot of them are controlled by different entities, and the strength and the actual control is far less. For one example, you have Aziz ibn Waq, who is a Turkic general, and he takes control of Syria. He creates the Emirate of Aleppo from the Hamdanids, and he makes it his own emirate. He is himself overthrown by Tutush I, who makes his own Emirate of Aleppo, both of them declaring loyalty to Nizam al-Mulk and the Shah, and the Seljuk leader that he was responsible to at that time, who was Malik Shah I, the successor of Alp Arslan. And you have these numerous different Turkic tribes controlling these small little principalities up and down the coast of the Levant region, throughout Anatolia. And so you don't have a unified Seljuk front. You have all these different governors who have their own distinct territories of control. So this map is from 1090, and you can see almost all the territories that are in that sort of orange-brown are the areas in control of the Seljuks, at least nominally. So you've got the Ghaznavids still in Pakistan, you've got the Karakhanids in Central Asia, you have the Byzantines surrounding the Aegean and Black Seas, and the Fatimids in Egypt. The Seljuks were able to reclaim Mecca and Medina for the Sunnis. Now you can see from the map that there's a star on Isfahan because their capital was in Isfahan. So you can see that it wasn't just Nizam al-Mulk. The Persian bureaucracy became part and parcel of the Seljuk government style. And so it made perfect sense for the Seljuks, despite being Oghuz Turks, not to have their capital in Central Asia, not to have their capital in Anatolia, which is what we would think because they're Turks, right? But in Iran. And that was where, and although the capital would change location several times, the Great Seljuk Empire would never be headquartered outside of Iran. So I want to sort of show this. It's hard to find a map of the exact political situation, but you can see this one from the year 1090 on the left-hand side that shows all of these small little statelets. And that's really what the Seljuk Empire looked like. It was this mass of all these different statelets. Now, these particular ones that are colored in because they're run by Arab tribes. But there were a number of other statelets that existed throughout the Seljuk Empire that were just as small or just as large as these ones were. So after Malik Shah died, the empire divided in two, more or less. The areas in Persia and Central and Khorasan remained part of the Great Seljuk Empire. And you can sort of see it on the map on the right-hand side, all the areas that are in that orange area, starting with Iraq into Iran and Central Asia. And those domains came under the Seljuk Emperor Berkyaruk. As we move into the Crusades, Berkyaruk and his Great Seljuk Empire are more or less irrelevant. What matters is the confederations to the west, which we're going to talk about eventually when we get to the Crusades. All right, Berkyaruk controls the area in the east. On the west, you have the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. And now Rum is sort of an interesting name for what is, of course, Anatolia. They called it Rum because they saw the Byzantines as Romans. And so this was to them what Rome was. This is Rome. The rendering Rum is simply because of the vowel shift in Turkish, right? So and so anything associated with Rome, such as the Greek Orthodox Church, became Rum, which is why you have, for example, the Rum millet in later Ottoman period days, right? So you have the Greek Orthodox Church, which is represented by Rum, and the Seljuk Sultanate that controlled Rum, but nothing else, called itself the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. And they were ruled by Idrissids Arslan, and their ability to attack the Byzantines was due to the fact that they had light cavalry. And I think that's where we should finish today. So, I know we covered a lot of different entities, and it's a little confusing. So are there any questions?
This is approaching the Crusades, right?
Yeah, we're basically at the door of the Crusades.
Yep.
So next week we are going to talk about Crusade.
No, next week we're going to talk about Spain.
Spain. Oh, okay.
Yeah, just to prefigure that, it was the this conquest of most of Anatolia by the Seljuks that resulted in the Byzantine Empire sending up an appeal to the Pope for help in protecting Christendom from the Muslim Turks. And that led to, and then the Pope called for the First Crusade. I mean, things got complicated after that, but it was precisely this that led to the First Crusade. Thanks.
That's exactly right. This is a huge transition in the Islamic world, right? Because when we talked about the Umayyads and we talked about the Abbasids, we talked about, the Abbasids in the first 100 years. We talked about Arab rulers governing large empires of non-Arabs who are slowly converting to Islam, right? Egypt does not become majority Muslim until the 10th century. Syria in the same, Iran the same. So the Umayyads and the Abbasids are governing large populations. They're majority non-Muslim, but they do have large Mawali populations. And we're shifting from a period where you have Arabs as a minority governing a larger minority to that minority rising up and governing itself. And also Mawali coming from outside the empire, but who have the ability, because of the strength of horsemanship and an organization, to effectively conquer the territories themselves and run them more effectively, right? But at the same time, they're using the bureaucratic systems that were built and honed during the Umayyad and Abbasid periods, and those periods were using the systems that had existed during the Byzantine and Sassanid periods, only modernizing and agglomerating them together.
But you also remember one of the previous meetings, I mean, back in the days, you mentioned that Seljuks had used Persian or Sassanids administration system. I remember you were mentioning that as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The Seljuks were using a Persian bureaucracy and aristocracy to run their empire, because while they were very effective at fighting, they realized that the Persians had a much more effective system of city maintenance and country maintenance.
Right. So I just, Jason, you want to ask a question? I want to give one idea that probably everybody's going to like. Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, question. Is that true? Umayyad wear white robe and Abbasid wear black robe?
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah, because in Chinese history, we call the Umayyad white, and we call the Abbasid black. So because they wear the clothes differently. So I'm not sure how true it is. Right now, I start to not believe in what I learned before.
No, in the Arab world, the Umayyads flew a white flag. That was typically how they identified that they were Umayyad.
Okay, so that's true.
And the Abbasids flew a black flag. So that it's not entirely out of nowhere. But yes, but the names Umayyad and Abbasid refer to their clans, because of course they derived their right to rule from their Arab lineage. Right. One of the things that we see among the Mawali is when the Mawali take power, they never take power in their name. They take power in the name of some legitimate Arab, right? In the case of Alp Arslan, right? He had that agreement, Tughril-Beg and then the rest of the Seljuks after him. He had that agreement with the Caliph that he was a legitimate ruler and that he would have the terrestrial power while the Caliph had the legitimacy to grant him that. So this is very different from the Umayyad and Abbasids, who were their own caliphs and terrestrial rulers until the anarchy at Samarra. I also want to say, in terms of future lessons, we are going to do Spain next week. Then the following 2 weeks, I'd like to take off. And then we will start again on, I believe that is September the 21st. And at that point, either we're going to finish Spain, because Spain is, I'm going to cover 700 years, so it might be 2 sessions, or we'll start the Crusades at that point. So that's, and of course, next week, as I said, is Spain. So that's going to be August 31st.
Sounds pretty good.
So Spain has been in Muslim country for 700 years?
Parts of Spain have been under Muslim control for 700 years.
Oh.
The majority of Spain was under Muslim control for about 350 years.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Richard, of course, in the modern West, we have the idea of a quite strong separation of church and state, the spiritual power versus the political power.
Sure.
I guess to some extent, this goes back to the Holy Roman Empire, which what's the parallel between that? I mean, in the Seljuks, I guess in a sense, there was somebody who had, was it a similar division of spiritual power versus political and military power? Or what is the parallel there?
It depends at what period of time we're talking. During the Seljuk period that we're talking about here, the ecclesiastical power was exclusively with the Caliph, who had no terrestrial power at all. And so there was a lot of communication between the Seljuk leadership and the Caliph. And there were questions about, for example, the certification of judges, because judges were almost always religious leaders. But generally speaking, it was much more similar to the European medieval style of the Pope had the ability to certify or not certify a European monarch. The Pope had the ability to make an entreaty that, you know, you attack this group or you attack that group or whatever it is. It's the same with the caliphs in this case, but I would say that the reach of the caliph, especially during this period, was far weaker than that of the Pope, because you have to realize the most powerful countries in the world, one of them is loyal to him and the other one deeply despises him, right? That's Fatimid Egypt. Fatimid Egypt couldn't care what the caliph does because he's the leader of a heretical faith.
Richard, but did they follow the Sharia law or
They followed a Sharia. They like Sharia is a process,
Sharia.
Right? Sharia is a process. So different leaders have applied it differently. But yes, during this period, in terms of what was the governing law would have been the Sharia because it would be enforced by the judges, right? And this is different than and this was sort of a change. Because when the Seljuks were nomadic, right, we talk about the Oghuz being those vassals of the Khazars, and then they became vassals of the Karakhanids in that early period. In that early period, they weren't Muslim, right? They converted to Islam when they came into contact with the Karakhanids. But before that period, they weren't Muslim. They were operating by the laws of Yasa, which are, right, if we go into Tengri religion, right, the religion of the worship of the sky, there was a code of law called the Yasa, and that's what they followed. And so when they adopted Islam, they brought along a lot of their traditions from their Tengrist roots, from their nomadic roots as well. But by implementing this Persian bureaucracy, the Persian bureaucrats said, no, you can't do this. These things are not acceptable. And so you had sort of a clash of functional rule as the Persian bureaucracy expanded its reach under the Turks, and the views the Turks had when they conquered territory. Because remember, when the Seljuks were conquering, they were bringing all these nomadic tribes and confederations with them while they were doing the conquering. That's how they amassed such a large army. because it wasn't just one clan, it was a number of Central Asian Oghuz clans. So
were always on the move? I mean, they were always, or do they stay in one place?
well, that was the whole genius of the Iqta system that Nizam al-Mulk created, right? So you have, yeah. So you can see here, right? You can sort. These divisions are too big to be Iqta, but like what he did is that he said that if you, as a Turkic clan, you have the right to claim territory, and you can govern that territory and extract wealth from it. You just can't hurt the people who are on it. Which means that all of the different Turkic confederations that were fighting alongside Alp Arslan to conquer the territory of Anatolia, that they had a stake in winning because they had a territory that they could rule. And then once they had that, they could stop being nomadic, right? They could be quasi-nomadic on the land that they controlled, but they didn't have to go anywhere. They weren't mobilized.
Okay.
And when that happened, right, now the Persian bureaucracy starts rolling because now you have a contiguous territory, and you can start to implement homogenization rules. And so that's when a lot of these Turkic tribes that had been following the Yasa, because they converted to Islam, but they didn't follow all the traditions immediately. That's when they started becoming integrated into the legal system.
That's interesting.
In fact, we have evidence of Tengri worship in Eastern Anatolia into the 13th and 14th centuries. It's very rare, but we still have some of it.
Also, a question: Karakhanids, when Genghis Khan conquered it, was it always a Muslim state at the time?
Karakhanids and Karakhanid are two different groups.
Oh, I'm sorry, I confused.
Yeah, no, it's confusing because Kara just means black in Turkic. So you have the Black Khanids and the Black Khitai. Two different groups.
They were Tangric, right? I mean, they were Buddhist.
Yes. Yeah, some were Tangri, some were Buddhist. But yes, there were Karakhanids are another confederation that was further east of the Karakhanids. So they never converted to Islam.
Right. Were they Turkic too, or?
Yes, Turco-Mongolic. I don't know what their language was.
Oh.
But yeah, one of the things that we, I guess, sort of forget about Central Asia is that it's not a hard borderline between any one of these different nomadic tribes. So there's always interaction, but the Khitai were much further east than the Karakhanids. That's also why the Russians called China Khitai, because their interaction with China was through the Khitai.
Right. It makes sense. it makes a lot of sense. Karakhanids.
Which I thought was funny when I started learning basic Russian, and it's like, this country is called Khitai. I'm like, no, the Khitai are the enemies of these people.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting. They were there for a couple hundred years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the things that I didn't mention is that the reason the Seljuks had such a large force behind them was that there was an expansion of the Khitai from areas close to what's now Korea through Mongolia, and those pushed a number of tribes out and further west. And so those tribes then saw this Seljuk thing beginning, and they're like, we'll get on that train. So it was very helpful to them.
Wow, interesting. I mean, one thing I found particularly interested, and then you probably had mentioned it, and I apologize I missed it, but Seljuks were eliminated. A lot of the administrators of Seljuks were eliminated by Hashashids.
Yes.
And they were quite quite effective in that regard.
Yeah, no. As I mentioned, Nizam al-Mulk was killed by an assassin.
But that's Crusades, isn't it? Was there anything prior to that?
Yeah, no. I didn't cover it today because I wanted to sort of cover the assassins together with the Crusades. But yes, the Nizari Ismaili movement starts before the Crusades do.
Yeah, I mean, I am so particularly interested, especially with that. And I know, man, I'm being corny with that movie coming out with Marco Polo, when they were talking about them as being kind of extinct. You
Well,
know,
I mean, the thing is that Hulagu Khan eliminated them.
correct. That's what I'm saying. Right. He eliminated them because they presented so much trouble. I mean, you know, in the mountains, you know, a couple of fanatics, you know, little eliminating Christians
But
to.
I've read Terry Jones's History in the Crusades, and basically the moment somebody had the Arabs united, he got murdered.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest one was the Baldwin.
Yeah.
You know, you know, he was the head of the you know, the Crusaders in Jerusalem. That was the biggest murder, the most publicized one.
I mean, they tried to kill Saladin too. They failed, but they tried to kill Saladin also.
Yeah, but the funny
Didn't they go after Richard too?
What?
Didn't they go after Richard as well?
I don't know. That I don't know. They may have done.
Tried too. Yeah, Richard Lionheart. But the funny thing is, they converted to Christianity and lived as monks for years before rounding out Baldwin in the alley. So that's some amazing, what is it? I mean, fanatism, one thing. Another thing is being able to be such a great actor. It's just crazy.
Yeah.
I'm just surprised that there's not enough, there's separate movies about them. You know.
Yeah. No. What I thought was funny is that, like, there was a Marco Polo series on Netflix, and they included assassins, and like they actually have to explain in dialogue. Wait, aren't the assassins like gone? And he's like, no, it's a secret branch of assassins that somehow survived in Eastern China.
Well, how historical was that? Like there's one of the Hollywood movies about the British in India had them fighting the thugs.
Yeah, no, I would say the first season, because there's 2 seasons of it. The first season, I would say, is like 40% historical.
Yeah.
Like the people there were there. That the main plot line, which is that Kublai Khan is trying to take the city of Xiangyang in southern China to defeat the Song. That was accurate. The reputation of the cricket minister Jia Sidao, that's accurate. The relationship between Kublai Khan and Chabi, his first wife, that's accurate. But there are things that are completely wrong there. One thing is, for example, there's no romantic plot line in reality between Marco Polo and Kokichin. There was one prince, and in fact, Kokichin is a hybrid of 2 different characters in reality who both have the name Kokichin. And the Wushu fighter, 100 Eyes, there's no analog to him in reality. And we don't know to what extent Marco Polo participated in the wars that Kublai Khan fought, where the indication is that he really didn't. He was much more of an ambassador and a governor than he was a military soldier. But he
was around it. I mean, I think as an outsider for being around it. By the way, Richard, I didn't know you liked that series. That's a whole other thing we can talk about.
I liked the series too, but I didn't know how historical it was.
So I will say one thing. Benedict Wong, who played Kublai Khan, was phenomenal. I mean, the costuming. I mean, I don't care. It could be 100% bullshit. Watch the series to watch him as Kublai Khan. Like, it's basically almost like a theatrical production on Broadway to watch him play Kublai Khan. It's really phenomenal.
Is there a record in Chinese of Marco Polo? That was the other one I was hearing about. I don't think the Chinese had anything written down about him.
No, I don't think there's a Chinese record of Marco Polo.
Well, yeah, and remember, they kind of rewrote the let's call it the good guy chronicles of the Mongols out of modern Chinese history, right? So I don't think that's a real big.
I mean, the thing is that Marco Polo fits into a part of Mongol history called Samarra.
Yes.
Where the Mongols would employ people from other parts of the empire in order to avoid them having local loyalties that could be otherwise from the Mongol loyalties. So you have a number of cases of Chinese being employed in Central Asia, for example, or in Persia, and you have cases of Persians especially, but Marco Polo also, being employed in China, right? Yep. So they don't have that local connection. The one other thing that I thought was really interesting and was authentic in the Marco Polo series is that the reason that Xiangyang falls is the use of trebuchets, which the Chinese were unfamiliar with.
That's right.
So the first season, I would say 40% historical. Second season, 20%. Like the only thing that's really historical about the second season is that there was a civil war between Kaidu and Kublai Khan. The difference is that it doesn't take 1 year; it takes 30 years.
Yeah.
Um,
But I will say this: it's really worth watching just to see Kublai Khan on. I mean, if they could literally have made a 1 season of Kublai Khan, and it just seriously, it was like a incredible. The way they conceptualized his throne room, basically his sort of mannerisms, the sort of hot coldness that he had behaviorally. I thought that was really that was really well done. And the guy Benedict Wong, who played Kublai Khan, is a phenomenal Chinese actor, or Hong Kong actor actually. So,
right.
No, Chinese, I guess. Whatever. Sorry, I can't say that anymore. I can't say Hong Kong movie. I have to say no. It's a joke.
Question. I have question, Richard. You mentioned trebuchet was not known to Chinese. Where did the Mongolians took it from? I thought they learned all of those siege techniques from Chinese.
No, they learned siege technology from Chinese. They didn't like in terms of building. I forget what they're called. The ones that go against the wall of a castle.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things they learned from the Chinese. The trebuchets they learned actually from the Middle East. There were trebuchets in use during the Crusades.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, no.
So they learned something from Christians and brought it against Chinese. That's
what I wanted to do, guys. I mean, at some point, maybe in October, I wanted to tear a movie apart, like they take Gladiator or take a series of Marco Polo and kind of like discuss it, hash it out. We're not going to, pick any pieces of it, but what is the historical account and how close it is? Obviously, bearing in mind that this is a, Hollywood production or Netflix production.
It was wonderful series, by the way. I loved it. I mean, even
they lost money on it.
It's okay to deviate.
They lost money on it on Netflix. I heard they lost.
And I cannot understand why.
That must have been an expensive series.
It was $100 million to make the series.
Okay, but how do you lose or make money on a series on Netflix? I'm not sure I understand that model.
No, you don't. I mean, they didn't lose money. It's content development.
I heard very taxing, and they had to raise the fees or something like that. It wasn't.
No. They have the amount of they produce $10 billion a year in content.
At that time, it wasn't that popular. I mean, not that popular. Netflix was just coming up, and they did this series. It was their first original.
I'm sure Netflix has some accounting procedure for working out how much a movie is worth to them.
Yeah, or series, but I mean, you don't underestimate from our perspective when we say something doesn't work. That's just our perspective, right? So Netflix, which is in over 100 countries now, having content like this sells differently in other parts of the world, and people can view that. They can let's say they could be inspired by it differently than we would content wise, just because it's a different story than they're used to seeing. So I'm just saying
I think Netflix knows when the stuff is being streamed, so they can walk back and say, here's how much time people spent watching this movie, here's what it costs us to do the streaming, and here's what it costs us to make the movie, and they can work out whether or not the movie makes money.
Or the series makes money.
My personal favorite foreign interpretation is when they remade Red Dawn. And somewhere along the line, having identified the Chinese as the evil villains, it dawned on them where something like half the revenue from action pictures comes from.
Yeah. So I will say a couple of things about the Mongol trebuchets. So they built over 5,000 of these, so this was arguably it's almost one of these less appreciated insane Mongol kind of statistics, right? I mean, they basically had probably the most integrated artillery at scale until you get to probably Napoleon, and yeah, probably that's probably about right. and until you get to sort of the U.S. Civil War and sort of modern mechanized warfare. So the Mongols, it wasn't just horses. I mean, it wasn't just cavalry.
No, I've seen argued that Genghis Khan's army was really integrating the logistics and stuff like that.
That's right.
I thought the Europeans usually besieged the castle and then they went out and they manufactured their siege equipment on the spot.
Yeah, no, we're going to talk about that during the Crusades.
If you need a catapult or a trebuchet or something like that, and there's a forest nearby, you just chop down the trees rather than transport the damn thing with you.
Sure, but they also maintained, dependent on where they were going and how limited the ecology was, they also built the extremely modular trebuchets. So that was one of the things they did, is they had these sort of small, medium, large, basically, categories. So they could have smaller trebuchets, which were very fit for purpose.